Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Big Creek in Denali National Park in Alaska. This area should sound familiar to you if you regularly watch our episodes. Napier Shelton, James McGowan, and Jack Reed were each parties to a grizzly bear attack in this area. I've linked to each of these episodes in the video article below if you'd like to review those episodes following this one. Each of their attacks have interesting and educational videos on our channels. Big Creek flows northeast from the north slope of Igloo Mountain into Igloo Creek, which flows into the Teklenika River. This watershed is a somewhat remote system that is over 11 miles long and offers visitors solitude and scenery found very rarely elsewhere. Big Creek averages 2,388 feet high in elevation and is mountainous. The hillsides here are covered in alder and willow brush that is generally less than 10 feet high. Brush here grows so closely together that a natural hedge is formed, forcing animals to tread well-worn paths in between. In the creek bottoms, birch and aspen trees rise, adding to the palette of color with which Mother Nature paints her masterpieces each season. Common animals here include moose, caribou, and Dall sheep, and can be viewed grazing their way across slopes and crags alike. Predators in this area include foxes, wolves, as well as black bears and brown bears. On the evening of July 23, 1973, 24-year-old Mark Carey and 26-year-old Roger Pearson were trekking through Big Creek. At this time, grizzly familiarity and awareness was in its infancy. In the decades following this incident, a series of basic guidelines would be established to aid in avoiding confrontations with grizzly bears. The last thing a backcountry camper wants to do is surprise a bear or accidentally walk upon a food cache they may be guarding. Today, we have the benefit of this knowledge, but back in the 70s, these lessons had yet to be learned, let alone applied. After a long day of hiking and a fair amount of bushwhacking through dense brush, Mark and Roger had arrived at a promising camping site. The young men were open-air camping, which means they were not utilizing the shelter of a tent or bivouac. Some people may know this as cowboy camping, as it involves laying in your bed beneath the stars, like the cowboys did in prior eras. Basking in the glory of the heavens as they sleep appeals to some, even more than the apparent safety a tent offers. The campers had laid out a ground cloth beneath their bedrolls to prevent moisture from wicking to their sleeping bags from the damp soil. It isn't indicated in my sources whether the men started a campfire, nor if they had a firearm with them, so it's assumed that they had neither. After a long day's hike, their sleeping bags must have been a comforting reprieve from the brush and rigors of the hike. The men relaxed beneath the expanse of stars and galaxies spread before them, interrupted only by the black silhouettes of mountains and trees. Just before midnight, the men were abruptly awakened from sleep by rustling in the bushes near their campsite. The surrounding brush closed in on their location and prevented them from seeing very far into the cover. As they gazed toward the rustling, a sow grizzly suddenly emerged from cover and charged up to the edge of their ground cloth. She was chuffing and swatting the ground with her paws, sending sticks and dirt flying in an intimidating demonstration of power. Just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned tail and disappeared back into the brush. While searching the bushes with their flashlights, the men could see a total of 6 eyes glowing back toward them from only a few yards away. They could see the outline of what appeared to be a larger bear, with 2 bears about half the size of the other. This was clearly a sow with 2 cubs from the prior year. The cubs would likely have weighed well over 100 pounds after a few years with their mother. The proximity of 3 grizzlies to the men's campsite was not the best-case scenario, and their safety was immediately in question. As soon as the flashlight illuminated the bears, the sow charged back toward Roger and Mark. She flashed through the brush, and it whipped in submission to her power. Once again she ran up to the edge of their ground cloth and swiped her paws at the ground and chuffed her displeasure to their presence on her turf. Concern for the safety of her cubs drew her back in their direction after a few seconds. The men knew that she meant business, but really had no options but to stay quiet and still. They hoped she'd realize that they were no threat to her and her cubs, despite taking her by surprise with their campsite. For some reason, Roger decided to stand to his feet. Perhaps he thought she was confused as to what the men were. Undoubtedly, she had smelled their scent at some point, but may have been confused by their lack of showing themselves. Roger had apparently had some difficulty in unzipping his sleeping bag and had pulled himself to his feet while still inside of it. Upon seeing Roger standing, the sow ran toward the men. This time she wasn't going to stop at the edge of their ground cloth. Mark laid still inside of his sleeping bag, which may have prevented the sow from attacking him initially. She leapt right over him and proceeded to vent her rage on Roger while he was still stuck in his sleeping bag. The protective and angry sow swatted Roger several times and bit at him, while his sleeping bag concealed him from her jaws somewhat. As he watched the sow brutalize Roger, Mark climbed from his own sleeping bag, which drew the sow's attention from Roger and onto him. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Why didn't Mark just lay still? But I think after watching a giant grizzly jump right over you, the only thought I imagine would go through my mind would be to get as far away as possible. Oftentimes in these fast and confusing attacks, the logic of analysis isn't a luxury offered. Survival instincts tend to kick in, and self-preservation moves people to do things that might not seem as logical afterward. As Mark emerged from his sleeping bag, the sow spun on her heels and swatted him with a resounding thump alongside his left ribs. The power of her blow sent Mark spinning to the ground in pain. Playing dead at this point was not hard for Mark, as he did his best impression of a clothing store mannequin. He laid still and hoped the sow would be convinced her blow had separated his spirit from his body. At this point, Roger decided his best bet was to play dead as well. He had already been knocked to the ground by the sow and did his best to convince her he was no longer breathing. He forced his body to hide the pain inflicted by her swats and laid still. The sow quickly glanced around after both men fell to the ground and did not move. She was apparently satisfied that she had neutralized all the threats to her and her cubs from the men. She disappeared once again into the brush. Following being battered by the grizzly, the men were in no hurry to move. They were concerned any movement may bring her back to renew her attack on them. After a few minutes of listening to the bears move away through the brush, the men whispered back and forth, assessing the condition of each other. Knowing that they had several dark hours before the relative safety of daylight, they laid still and talked to one another. After waiting until daylight, they began to assess each other's wounds inflicted by the perturbed sow. Mark Carey had numerous gashes opened up along the left side of his back. His wounds were painful and bleeding, but were not immediately life-threatening. Roger was not as fortunate as his hiking partner. He had numerous bruises on his right shoulder from the impact of the sow's massive paws. His left eye had also been impacted by her paws at some point in the attack and was swollen and scratched up. Despite surprising the bear with their camp location, the men were left with relatively minor injuries compared to what may have been inflicted upon them had the sow chosen to do so. Neither man suffered any bites from her powerful jaws, but not for lack of trying. Roger's sleeping bag was evidence that she'd tried to find something to sink her teeth into, but had somehow managed to miss him with each bite. The men gathered their camp together and immediately made their way back out of Big Creek to safety. After receiving medical attention, both men made a complete recovery from their injuries. I could find no source indicating what happened to the sow and her cubs. It is assumed that there were no efforts to kill or find them, as her reactions were not fatal, and she did not try to claim the men as a food source. Once she left, her aggression toward the men ceased, so she was clearly acting in defense of herself and her cub. After reviewing the details surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the presence of her cubs curbed the sow's attack on the men? If she hadn't had to check on her cub's safety, would she have continued her attack? Today it is recommended that backcountry campers pitch camp a few hours before evening to avoid moving while bears are most active. Given these men were approached by the bears after pitching their camp, does this advice ring true to you? What could Mark and Roger have done to avoid this attack? Do you think a Kevlar sleeping bag is a good idea in grizzly country? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote town of Luther, Montana. The most recent census indicates that Luther has only 42 people, so it seems more like an area than a town. Luther is seated right at the base of the Beartooth Mountains, to the north of the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. Its elevation is about a mile high, and the terrain around it is forested slopes, giving way to flatter, high plains. The most common trees in the mountains include pine, fir, larch, and hemlock, with willow and box elder growing beneath the tall green canopy. White-tailed deer, moose, and elk are common sights in this sportsman's paradise. The predators of this area include bobcats, cougars, coyotes, and brown bears. One bit of data that was left off the recent census was just how many black bears roam the woods around the town of Luther. In recent weeks, citizens have reported having their garbage cans and grills raided by black bears. They had even been seen prowling the streets at night, searching for anything that may pacify their hunger. Local food supplies vary in the amount and availability year to year, and finding enough calories can make bears search in unusual places from time to time. On the evening of Thursday, August 3rd, 2023, 27-year-old Thomas Bolcom and his fiancée, Celie Oblander, had been partying it up. They had had friends and family over and enjoyed libations and conversation well into the night. The young couple was getting ready to fly to Phoenix at 6 o'clock in the morning to celebrate their bachelorette and bachelor parties before getting hitched a few days later. Thomas was a commercial painter by trade and loved the outdoors. He was an avid hunter of the elk roaming the forests in the area. Celie just loved hanging out with her fiancé and playing with their lab pit bull mixed breed dog, Maisie. After retiring for the night, Thomas was awakened by Maisie barking intensely at something downstairs. It wasn't uncommon for the dog to tangle with a raccoon or skunk, so the couple initially blew the disturbance off as a run-in with one of them. This time, Maisie's bark seemed to be a different tone and tenor than when she had confronted animals in the past. Thomas knew he'd better go investigate if he was going to get any sleep before their departure in the morning. Thomas made his way downstairs in his underwear and t-shirt. The dark house could be hiding anything in its shadows, and he nervously navigated his way. As he entered the living room, he glanced around but didn't see anything unusual. Then Thomas turned around and stared right into the eyes of a 300-pound black bear standing less than 5 feet from him. It was almost like the bear had just materialized before his very eyes. For the better part of 5 seconds, the bear and the man just stared at each other. It was as if neither one had expected to see the other. Thomas was facing the bear with the front door beyond it. If he could somehow open the door, he was sure the bear would probably disappear back into the night. But due to where they were in relation to one another, that might get risky. He would have to somehow sneak past the bear to unlock and open the door, creating the possibility of getting bit, or something worse. He was hoping the bear would take the hint and find its own way out, but this bear didn't do that. It began to chuff at Thomas and acted boldly toward him, as if he were the intruder. This bear clearly did not plan on abandoning his plans of an easy meal to any skinny human in his skivvies. Thomas decided to dash back upstairs to retrieve his pistol. He quickly thundered up the stairs and grabbed it, making sure it was locked and loaded. He stammered in Celie's direction to stay put, because there was a bear downstairs. She obliged his request and agreed to let Thomas handle it, this time. As Thomas crept down the dark stairs, the bear slowly came into view. It was standing about where he had left it, and was still refusing to leave. Given there was no other realistic option, Thomas raised his pistol and fired, hitting the bear. That is when the bear decided he might be able to find a food source elsewhere and bolted into the sunroom. Thomas knew there was no way for the bear to escape there either, and quickly gave pursuit. Furniture and dishes went flying as the two tore up the place, each seeking his own resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding. Seeing no other option, Thomas pumped several more rounds into the bear as he chased it from room to room. The bear would run into one room, and Thomas would shoot it. Then the bear would head to another one, where Thomas would shoot it again. A trail of blood poured from the bear as it searched for a way to escape from this clearly upset man. After a circuitous and comical chase scene through the home, the black bear began to slow. It had clearly been shot several times, and was bleeding profusely. It defecated before slowly slumping to the floor, near a lampstand, and lay still. The chase through their home turned the place into an even greater disaster than the party had. There was now bear blood and excrement tracked throughout the home. The animal stunk to high heaven, and this was not how the young lovers had anticipated starting their married life. Thomas called the Montana Fish and Game and reported the home invasion and subsequent killing of the black bear. Investigating officers arrived on the scene soon thereafter. After looking over the home, they quickly recognized the shooting of the bear as a case of self-defense. Celie called their family members and recruited them to help clean up after the melee. They showed up and used a tarp to drag the bear's carcass outside of the home. The blood and feces were mopped up just in time for the soon-to-be newlyweds to head off to the airport. Celie was overheard stating that she'd never imagined that they would have a bear inside of their home. She said it was quite the wake-up call at 3 a.m. Chrissy Webb from the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks called the bear's behavior abnormal. She stated that this bear ended up dying because neighbors had left attractants out that brought it to the neighborhood. Thomas and Celie did not have food or garbage left out around their property, so the bear climbing through an open screen window was out of the ordinary. It must have smelled something coming from the home to bring it inside. After looking the bear over, officials stated the animal was likely about 10 years old and was a male. It appeared to be very healthy and had a luster to its beautiful coat. Seeley's father even expressed regret at the death of such a beautiful bear. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. What do you think it was inside the home that was so alluring to the bear? Why do you think the bear didn't just run out the same way it came in? Do you think the neighbors should be cited or fined for leaving out food and garbage? Do you think this is a sign of good luck for the newlyweds' marriage? I sure hope so. I'll enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Muddy Creek Trail, just northwest of a ranching area in western Montana called Blackleaf. The dot of a town called Chateau is the nearest reference point on a map. Other than that, the high plains is dotted with sprawling ranches and agricultural enclaves surrounded by amazing views and wilderness. The eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains tower above the horizon to nearly 8,000 feet in elevation, as the terrain slopes to around 5,000 feet on the plains below. Up Muddy Creek is an access road that leads up to forested mountains covered in pine, fir, and spruce stands that wrap around the granite peaks like a shroud. The riparian zones which grow along the creek beds are thick with willow and berry bushes, so much so the animals hiding in them don't move unless you practically step on them. The browsers and grazers here include elk, moose, and deer, with antelope prancing across the plains. The predators in this area include black bears, bobcats, cougars, and coyotes. Without any doubt, the most dominant predator here is the growing population of grizzly bears. Chase Delwell was a 26-year-old son of a rancher. He grew up on a cattle ranch just west of Bynum, near an area known as Blackleaf. When he was a child, he attended Bynum Elementary School, which had big windows that faced west and showcased the beautiful view of the nearby mountains. Chase and his schoolmates would occasionally watch grizzly bears graze their way across these mountains from the safety of their school. After graduating from Chateau High School in 2007, Chase immediately pursued his electrician's license. He loved the outdoors and was an avid bow hunter, with his favorite quarry to pursue being the numerous elk of the area. Now, over the years, Chase had had his run-ins with bears. He'd even been charged by them on occasion, but each time the bear had stopped and diverted its path, leaving him scared but safe. He knew they could be dangerous, and even deadly, but generally meant no harm to people. On Saturday, October 3rd, 2015, Chase and his 30-year-old brother Shane had planned to go elk hunting with their bows up Muddy Creek Road. The wind howled to gusts of over 30 miles per hour and drove the rain and snow sideways, making it difficult to keep dry and warm. The brothers were not carrying bear spray, not that it would have done any good in weather like this. They felt assured of their safety, though, as this area was practically their backyard, and they knew it like the back of their hands. They were decked out in full-body camouflage so that they would blend into their environment better, but would not use elk urine to hide their scent as the weather was far too windy and wet to carry it far anyway. Just after sunup, around 7 a.m., the young men arrived at the bottom of Muddy Creek. It didn't take long for them to spot a herd of elk a few hundred yards away to the west of their truck. The brothers examined the terrain and formulated a plan to stalk the herd. Chase would hike along the creek bed to the east of the herd, while Shane would hike up a ridge to their west. This pincer kind of strategy is intended to create opportunities for at least one of the hunters to get a shot. Chase would essentially hike into position, then move toward the herd, in effect driving them toward his brother, who would be waiting in ambush along the herd's expected escape route. After ironing out the details of their plan, the brothers left their truck and began hiking toward their starting positions. The raging wind battered the willows around Chase as he pushed his way through them along the creek bed. The willow stands were so thick in places that he had to crawl between tangled gaps just to get past. As Chase scrambled and crawled through the tangled undergrowth, he heard the high-pitched scream of a large herd bull elk on the ridge above him. This bull had to be only 100 yards or so from him, and its bugle charged the bowhunter with excitement. As he continued to hike up the creek bed, Chase's gaze drifted up the ridge in search of the source of the high-pitched bugle. As Chase scanned the hillside, he pulled an arrow from his quiver and nocked it, which means he placed it on his bowstring. Bowhunters frequently do this when they expect to get a shot soon, as retrieving the arrow from the quiver and placing the nock of the arrow on the string forces a bowhunter to divert their vision momentarily. Taking your eye off of your quarry frequently results in losing sight of it, and could blow your chances of getting a shot on it. As Chase rounded a willow bush, he glanced over to a dark mound that had suddenly come into view. His terror shot up as soon as he realized this dark mound was a huge grizzly bear that was sleeping. Note, I said was sleeping. By the time Chase and the grizzly could process what was going on, the bow hunter had inadvertently walked right up to the dozing 400-pound Bruin. The grizzly was laying on its belly and facing away from Chase. The distance between them was about 3 feet and was danger close, as each of them would agree. The bow hunter knew he was practically defenseless, and how this confrontation would play out was completely up to the bear. It would hopefully dash off and not attack him, but the alternative was also possible. Chase took 2 or 3 steps back from the bear, and that is when the grizzly realized he was there. With a large bark, the giant bear swapped ends and instantly put the bow hunter on his back. Startling a grizzly bear is kind of like inviting a dangerous murderer over for dinner. They aren't known for gently waving off misunderstandings. This bear immediately locked its enormous jaws around Chase's face and tore through the young man's flesh. Chase could hear the bear's teeth grating against his skull, but was powerless to resist the overwhelming mass and strength of the grizzly. Now at the mercy and fury of the startled grizzly, Chase felt his skull cracking near his left temple. If this portion of his skull gave way to the bear's teeth, shards of his bones would be pushed into his brain, likely killing him quickly. Once Chase was incapacitated, the grizzly relented, likely thinking it had killed this threat to its existence. The Bruin released its jaws from Chase's head and watched him for signs of life. Still confused and charged with adrenaline, Chase sat up and looked around briefly. He could see the bear a mere few feet from him, watching him. Seeing the man moving was all the bear needed to return to finish him off. The grizzly once again pounced on Chase. This time it drove its canines through the flesh of his leg and punched giant holes deep into his muscles. As it shook its head, it tossed the bow hunter around violently, which put him once again flat on his back. From there the grizzly moved its gaping mouth toward Chase's face to bring an end to this fight. It was at that moment that Chase thought of a lesson from his grandfather. He recalled a discussion the two had had about an article which indicated that bears had a strong gag reflex when anything was unexpectedly shoved into their mouths. Think about how a person reacts when an insect mistakenly flies into their mouth. Bears similarly cough and gag and try to spit out whatever it is that's irritating their throat. With this information flashing through his mind, Chase quickly extended his right arm toward the grizzly's mouth as it came toward him. He plunged his hand right past the bear's giant teeth and as far down its throat as he could. This took the bear completely by surprise, and at first it tried to bite Chase's arm. The discomfort of having a human hand shoved down its throat caused the bear to gag and heave. It shook its head back and forth, trying to dislodge Chase's arm from its mouth. After only a few seconds, the bear was able to shake the bow hunter's hand loose. It quickly took a few steps back to reassess what had just happened. It apparently had had enough of Chase, and dashed off toward the east. Chase wasn't sure just where he was, but knew which direction the bear had gone, and he went the opposite way. Scrambling and clawing his way through the brush, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and quickly dialed his brother. As he watched the screen of his phone, he felt his blood trickling down his cheek and onto his clothes. He could feel the left portion of his scalp dangling down over his face, obstructing the vision of his left eye. As he parted the brush, trying to put distance between himself and the bear, Chase glanced up the hill. He could see that huge 6-point bull elk a short distance away. He knew his elk hunting was over for the time being, and disappointedly continued to call out for Shane. As he climbed the hill, Chase knew he had to calm himself. He was huffing and puffing from the exertion and terror of the grizzly attack. His eyes searched the terrain for the most likely place his brother would be. After walking a few hundred yards, he'd finally located Shane. As he approached his brother, Chase hefted his bow above his head and waved it to draw his brother's attention. Shane optimistically took this as a sign of success and briefly thought his brother had bagged an elk. As Chase approached him, the stark reality of what had actually happened made his heart sink. Judging by the look on his brother's face, Chase knew he didn't look too good. Shane somehow kept his composure and reassured his brother that it would be okay, as he worked to stop the bleeding from the huge gashes on Chase's face. Shane used his cell phone to call Benfis, Teton Medical Center, a few miles away in Chateau. He told them they were about 33 miles away and he would be arriving soon with a grizzly mauling victim, so please be ready. Upon arriving back at their truck, Shane assisted his brother into the passenger side and jumped behind the wheel. Chase later described the 20 minutes it took the brothers to cover the 33 miles as driving too fast for the dirt roads. Back at the hospital, the trauma team was notified of the brothers' arrival. They were ready and waiting as soon as the young men pulled into the hospital parking lot and quickly wheeled Chase inside. After handing his brother off to the medical staff, Shane called Becca, Chase's wife. On most hunting trips, she would accompany her husband, but on this one, she'd stayed home. She drove to the hospital to be by her husband's side. The medical team immediately started to clean and suture Chase's wounds. He was soon transported by ambulance to Benfis Hospital in Great Falls for more intensive care. They placed hundreds of stitches as they pulled closed enormous gashes in his cheek and replaced his tattered scalp. For 5.5 hours, they worked on repairing the damage the grizzly had done to Chase's face. The bear's canines had punched deep holes into the flesh of his legs, but they could not be stitched closed. Those wounds needed to be left open in order to push out any infection that may develop, and instead were bandaged. Despite his numerous wounds, scrapes, and bruises, Chase was thankful to the medical staff and their excellent treatment they provided him. Following his surprise attack, Chase indicated that he will never again go into dense brush by himself, no matter what. Chase stated that everybody needed to take grizzlies more seriously, citing that Chateau Public Schools had recently shut down recess due to a grizzly wandering just west of the playground. The school children also reported seeing a grizzly near their bus stop the fall following Chase's attack. He concludes by stating that it was a good thing that it was him and not a 10-year-old kid that was attacked. Chase also put forth the idea that the grizzly management specialist from the Montana Fish and Game spend some time each fall in area schools, discussing how to handle grizzlies and prevent confrontations with them. Chase held no malice toward the bear, given it was merely sleeping, and seemed to be just as afraid of him as he was of it. Grizzly populations along the Continental Divide ecosystem are estimated to be around 1,000 bears and dwindle a bit along the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountain front. A balance of mutual respect and avoidance is being sought through education of area residents. In 2015, wild chokecherry and thorny buffalo berry yields had completely failed, driving the hungry bears to invade grain silos in search of food needed to fatten up for hibernation. As you look over the terrain around Chateau, I'm sure you'll conclude the same thing I did. The patchwork of fields and flat open land do not seem like prime grizzly territory. Grizzlies have started to move into the plains areas to feed off of grains grown there. They hole up to sleep during the daytime along the creeks in daybeds concealed by the dense brush, emerging at night to feed. That means unassuming bird hunters are beginning to find themselves face to face with grizzlies who are desperate and hungry. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Given the area grizzlies have taken up daybeds along creeks, how do you think people can avoid surprising them? Could this attack have been avoided by waiting until clearer weather prevailed? Are you surprised that grizzly attacked Chase instead of dashing off to safety? What would you do if a person crept up on you while you slept? I'd likely freak out and bite them too. I'll gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We've slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.